most Swedish Vikings went to east, to what's nowadays Russia.
Oh,
So they think that the name Russia comes from a part in Sweden called Roslagen, and that became Rus.
Professor Zander, it's a pleasure to have you on our program. Thank you for taking the time for this conversation with me. To talk about Sweden's history, I think we need to have some context first. So let's begin with some basic but quite important questions. Who are the people of Sweden?
Well, it's interesting because for a long time we said that Sweden is a very ethnic homogeneous country, but in a way it was very diverse already from the beginning, because
Oh,
the first who came to Sweden, they came from the south, and they come from very far away and came to what's Sweden today when the Ice Age came to an end some 10,000 years ago. And then there was another wave of, if we could call it immigration, but that was from the east. So already during the Stone Age, we had a very mixed population in Sweden. But after that, and for a long time, up until, say, the Second World War, uh, the migration to Sweden or from Sweden haven't been that great, with, of course, the exception of a great immigration in the 19th century, mostly to the US.
I see. Yeah, that's actually a very important point. Swedish immigration to the U.S., and we'll discuss that. I have a segment on that I'm excited to talk to you about. But before we go there, you said two things: immigration into Sweden from the south, and also you mentioned the east. In preparation for our conversation, I've come across several references to Germanic people coming to Sweden, and also I've come across the term Rus, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, R-U-S. Could you talk about that a little bit, please?
Yes, and I think since, like, Germany is a country that Sweden has always been in connection to, all long before it became a nation.
Okay.
So we had tribes moving both to and from these countries. So and especially in the early Middle Ages. And before that, we had Vikings that were on what is nowadays Sweden. And while many of those Vikings that were in what's today's Denmark or today's Norway headed south or west, most Swedish Vikings went to east, to what's nowadays Russia.
Oh,
So they think that the name Russia comes from a part in Sweden called Roslagen, and that became Rus. So some of the first
oh, that's
chiefs in
fascinating.
Russia is probably of Scandinavian or Swedish heritage.
Oh, that's really interesting.
But I don't think Vladimir Putin would like that as a history that he would write. But anyway,
Yeah, I agree with you. Mr. Putin may not like that. You mentioned the term Vikings, and around the world, especially here in America, everyone is so fascinated with Viking history, and we have all these Viking shows on the History Channel, on Netflix, name it, Amazon Prime. Um, Professor Zander, you mentioned the term Vikings, and you talked about how Vikings from Sweden moved east to Russia and may have become the ancestor of modern Russians. And this made me think, are the Vikings from Sweden different than the Vikings that we Americans and many people around the world in popular shows know from Denmark and Norway? You can see why I'm asking that question, because there's so many Viking shows on the History Channel, Netflix and what have you.
I don't think there was so different. We had this big debate in the early 20th century because there was this Viking who invaded Paris.
Oh,
And then the big question was, was this man from Denmark, Norway, or Sweden? And of course, that was impossible to answer because those nations weren't existing. And the other thing was that this was a man that moved quite freely between these areas. And I would say a lot of the culture of the Vikings are very similar for all those three connecting areas, because they were not like nation states that we see today.
I
So
see.
you could move quite freely within them. And some of what we now would call Swedish Vikings also, for instance, went south and fought in the south and also had some trade. And that is also like we know quite a lot of the Vikings, but there's still much to learn. And
I
that is
see.
also why you could use Vikings in so many different connections. So when Sweden was to be a part of Europe, then you could say that the Vikings, they were never violent. They never fought, as you see in the television series. They were open
Really?
to trade because we wanted to be a part of the European Union, known for its trade. So it's more like a political use of Vikings, and you see that quite a lot. But the older use of it was, of course, the Viking as a big warrior.
Yeah. So let me see. Let me make sure I understand this correctly. Um, Vikings from Sweden, the story of Vikings from Sweden is very much in mesh with those from, let's say, Norway and Denmark. And when we look at the attacks, let's say, on England or on France, or even as far inland as Paris, it's hard to distinguish which modern nation they came from. But in modern discussions, what the people of Sweden bring about their Viking heritage is the trade, not the war.
Well, it came and went, I would say.
Oh, he came
Nowadays, a
and went.
Viking is once more a warrior, more than a tradesman.
I see, because now you're part of the European Union, right?
Yes.
And now you
So,
can go back to the warrior past. Oh, that's very interesting. Um, you've mentioned this in the last few minutes several times, both about Sweden and then also later about Norway and Denmark. You said long before these countries became a nation. So let's talk about Sweden. When did Sweden become a nation? I suppose we can ask that question about any country, but I've heard this sort of discussed about Sweden.
well, it's been up to discussion this year because 2023 is
Oh,
the 500-year anniversary from when Gustav Vasa became King of Sweden. And that has, in a traditional way, been seen as the start of Sweden as a nation state. But I would say that most historians argue that it's already during the 13th century that we could find something that is more like becoming a Swedish state, because we have two rulers. One was called Birger Jarl, and the other, his son, Magnus Ladulås. And they did something very modern, you can say. They demanded tax from the
oh,
citizens. And as a return, they also promised to protect them. So you can see that they built quite a lot of castles and fortresses. And also, Birger Jarl, he is the founder of Stockholm. And Stockholm also becomes a center for what you could call an early Sweden.
yeah. So why do we go to King Gustav in 1523 versus the prior kings in the 13th century?
Well, that is kind of more obvious because you had this union between Denmark, Norway, and Sweden from 1397 up until 1523. And that was a union that was a result, you could say, of the Hanseatic League and areas in Germany that are very powerful because they have more or less monopoly of trade in the Baltic Sea region. So in Scandinavia, you find that we could perhaps be more powerful if we are in one union. But this is a union that will be very clearly dominated by Denmark. So some Swedes, and Gustav Vasa is the most successful of them, try to create independence. So you could say that
Ah,
he rebels against a king that is voted to be a Swedish king, but he's a Dane. So he makes a rebellion against this king and is successful.
oh,
So that you
wow.
could, during the 19th century, write the nation history, and that he became the hero. He is our founding father.
I see. That makes a lot of sense. So even though Sweden was part of a union of kingdoms, in effect, Denmark was more or less in charge, and Sweden wanted independence. So that's why 1523 is so important. In this period that we were just talking about, from the 13th century, the two earlier kings, all the way to 1523, something interesting happened that I noted and I wanted to speak with you about. Somewhere, let me see if I have the correct date. 1335, I see it in my notes. Slavery and serfdom were abolished in Sweden. Is that true?
Yes, that's true.
That's
And
so early in history. That's amazing.
yes, it is. And you could say, in a way, it could have happened even earlier, because
Huh.
it's an effect that Swedes becomes Christians. And Christians is the meaning at this time are not allowed to have slaves. But it will take up until 1335, because some say, well, you can't have slaves that are Christians. But if we take our ships and sail to the Baltic area, we could take slaves because they are not yet Christians. But after a while,
Oh,
they are also Christians, and then you can't make this escape from the rules. So then you say, well, now it's no more slavery.
I see. I see. So slavery and serfdom with respect to Christian people. And I take it that Sweden never had African slaves that or other from other parts of the world that were not Christian.
We later on during the 17th century, we had for a very short time a small harbor in Western Africa, and also Sweden took over an island in the Caribbean from France, and that on that island you had some slavery as well. So Sweden has also a history of slavery, but it's not, you couldn't compare it to Britain or France or
America.
similar countries.
Yeah. We'll be back after a short break to talk about the Swedish Empire. We'll be right back.